we're here at Columbia. We've got School of International Affairs. We also have many of our colleagues who are engaged in public work of one kind or another, and as well as New York being the seat of the United Nations, and many consuls and embassies. So we wanted to introduce now this panel, which allows us to have a kind of open up the debate about the legacy of the Congress. And I'd like to introduce our speakers. Let me start with Ambassador Antonio Patriota, who is the permanent representative of Brazil to the United Nations. He has been recently, until between 2011 and 2013, the Minister of External Relations for Brazil. And before that, a very long experience as a minister and as ambassador. He was also ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2009. He's also served as Brazil's permanent mission to the international organization in Geneva. I'd like to introduce then Beatrice de Graaf, who's professor of history of international relations and global governance at Utrecht. And her research interests include the history of international and national security in the West, counterterrorism, terrorism, and political violence. And she does also historical research on the development of security thinking. And she's currently working on a big project on securing Europe, fighting its enemies, 1815 to 1914. So she's here now both as in discussion, but will also be presenting her own work on the Congress of Vienna tomorrow. I'd like to then introduce Wolfgang Petritsch, who's president of the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. And he was a very wide experience as ambassador, representative of the European Union, the special envoy for Kosovo from 1998 to 99, EU negotiator for Kosovo peace talks at Rambouillet in Paris in 1999, high representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1999 to 2002, the Austrian ambassador to the UN at Geneva, and he's currently the Joseph A. Schumpeter Fellow at Harvard University. Gary Bass is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, and he's written widely on very important questions: the blood telegram, Nixon, Kissinger, and a forgotten genocide, freedom's battle, the origins of humanitarian intervention, Stay the Hand of Vengeance, the politics of war crime tribunals. His books have won understandably important awards. And he's also writes very widely for in the New York Times, The Economist, and other journals. So he's coming from Princeton University. So we want to open this up, with a question which you might, pose, and then you might all want to each speak for a couple of minutes on it, and then we'll shift around. It's about the relevance of the methods and the ideas of the Congress. So spoken about in the first panel about some of the new methods of international negotiations and new ways of thinking about international values and norms. And so the question comes up whether these methods are still relevant in today's world. Do practitioners have references to them? And I know you're coming in very different directions, but perhaps, Ambassador, could I start with you? I mean, let's just say, what do you know about the Congress of Vienna? You, an ambassador, with a very excellent classical education, of course.
Well, are the methods and ideas still valid today? I think I would side with those whose evaluation of the Congress today is favorable. Certainly, it was very interesting to hear Professor Jervis mentioning the ups and downs, how Wilson, through that quotation, viewed the Congress as something not to be repeated. But nowadays, it actually strikes me as a watershed in many respects, because it can be said to be the first instance where you have multipolarity at play. And why is this important for today's world? Because we're also heading towards a multipolar world. You can't really compare what's happening to the United States with, let's say, the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria says, with what happened to France at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But in a sense, there is a parallel because it is recognized that in today's world, no single individual power can determine outcomes individually. And this came about very progressively, not through a Waterloo moment, but through experiences that were frustrating in combating terrorism and the like in Iraq and Afghanistan, even now Syria, Libya, or other examples where strategies are being tried out and experimented with, but without the really satisfactory results. And I think this is something that the United States itself recognizes. So in that respect, I think that Vienna acquires a much more interesting value as a precedent, a precursor. Certainly in terms of the practices, there was a great deal of communication between the major players. They didn't necessarily agree all the time, but they were speaking to each other. And to my mind, this is something that, for example, someone like President Lula, who I worked under in Brazil, would always stress. He says, you can read documents, you can speak on the phone, you can have a number of ways of interacting with other countries, but nothing replaces, nothing is a substitute for direct interaction. In our part of the world, we have just gone through a recent experience in this regard because South America has now become a continent that has integration mechanisms for the first time in its history where the presidents meet at regular intervals for summits. And it's incredible how much difference that makes. There were tensions between Colombia and Ecuador and Venezuela, or between Bolivia and Chile, that could have developed into, let's say, very tense moments or even a minor conflict or something of that nature that were completely deflected because people meet at regular intervals, they have drinks together, they sit side by side, they end up recognizing that there are more commonalities or more values and objectives that bring them together than that drive them apart. The whole idea of conferences that last a few days where you try to iron out differences is one that is still very much with us and completely part of the UN system to which I am accredited now. Other practices that came out of the Congress, such as establishing precedents between ambassadors, chargés d'affaires, all these different protocol situations and items and understandings that are also fundamental for diplomacy. But there's another aspect that wasn't touched on before that, and maybe I conclude this initial comment with this, is that I think we should draw a very important lesson from the Congress also in terms of how the defeated power or the power that was trying to be contained was treated by the victors. I think to me that this is one of the keys of why the Congress of Vienna had such lasting impact in terms of promoting stability, because with the benefit of hindsight, I think Woodrow Wilson's quotation here sounds a little hollow, because what he accomplished in Versailles was of much lesser impact. In fact, Versailles generated such resentment in Germany that it sowed the seeds of the Second World War. Well, you can't say that about Vienna. Other developments came about, nationalism and other forces that had been actually awoken by Napoleon, and other dynamics were still at play in Europe. But the fact that France progressively was treated as an equal, and I don't know how much we have to attribute that to Talleyrand's genius. Certainly there's a little bit of that, that is part of the picture. But that was very important. And why is that important? Because nowadays, and I think you're familiar with the Mearsheimer article on the situation in Ukraine and Crimea, there are those who think that perhaps the Soviet Union, when it became the Russian Federation, was treated in less than friendly manner through NATO expansion, through other strategies when the Warsaw Pact was dismantled, where there were many around the world, including in Brazil, that thought, well, maybe NATO doesn't have to continue existing, but the opposite happened. So this is my initial comment. Thank you.
Beatrice, do you want to continue the very, very interesting question?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation and for engaging in this roundtable. Well, let me first stress one of the principal legacies of the conference for my country. My country was created at this conference, and next week marks the exact bicentennial of the finalizing of the first draft statement, which went unaltered into the final statement of the erection of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. So everyone forgot that in their textbooks. All of the authors sitting here, hardly anyone really mentions it, which gives enough floor for Dutch historians to, of course, work on that. But there's more to it than that. It's just the re-erection. It's not really the re-erection, it's the enlargement of the Netherlands with the Kingdom of Belgium, the Principality of Belgium, into a middle power nation. But what was so special to Vienna is that it was exactly that the Vienna Conference, the Vienna Settlement, invited minorities, smaller nations, smaller powers, and also non-European nations and countries to be part of the larger decision-making process. They were not part of the Pentarchy, of course not, but they had their say, and there was much more to that say than there is, again, I think, being written about, and that's a very important legacy for today. How our rights, our universal rights, how is the EU's European Publicum that came into being at that time, how is that used nowadays, and how is that inferred in large country political decision making? So that's one of the questions that I find highly striking. And I have a lot of other remarks to make on the conference of Vienna, but perhaps to broaden the scope to current day threats and practices. If you look, for example, on how the European and American powers now deal with Syria and Iraq and ISIS. Well, there was an intervention of European powers and United States in the 1860s, again with Syria. And that was also an outgrowth of the Congress system, you could argue. But what stood apart from the intervention then and now is, I think, the structural involvement then of non-European officials and diplomats in the joint military and police intervention. So first of all in the 1860s, and also in a number of interventions earlier, liberal ministers from the Ottoman Empire were invited to sit, for example, on the European Commission that entered Syria in 1860. So there's a huge difference. How are regional powers nowadays in the Middle East involved, in the Gulf, involved in the military interventions in Iraq and Syria? I mean, let alone if you should do it at all, that's a different question. But if that decision has been made already, so what about Iran? What about Saudi Arabia? Is there really persistent diplomacy, political decision-making pressure? Is that being issued on those countries to be part of the solution instead of refusing to cooperate with them? Of course, there are very good, very sound humanitarian and ideological reasons not to engage with these powers. But European American powers did so in the earlier days. The second part of one of the last remarks I'm going to make, the legacies of the Vienna Conference are very ambiguous. We discussed that already. They might be viewed more positive now than perhaps 100 years ago, but they're still highly ambiguous. You should only compare, for example, the Syrian intervention in the 19th century with the European American intervention against the Boxer uprising, which was in fact a carnival of loot. However, just to stress the importance of the Vienna Congress system, it had this element of legality and of the law of nations, a universal law of nations, ingrained in its practices. They were not always played out to force, but they were there, most notably in, for example, the deployment of police missions. So not just military interventions, but after the military interventions were concluded successfully, there was a police mission deployed in Syria to oversee the Mutasarufiat regime, for example, but also in other places where judicial procedures and prosecution systems and no impunity for perpetrators was secured. So I think that's an important legacy as well. So smaller nations, minorities, rights, it's an undercurrent to even the increasing bellicism of that age. It was already there as well. So how do we deal with that nowadays?
Ambassador Petritsch, I know you in this enormous experience in the Balkans, and I was wondering if you would reconceive it in terms of some sort of general peace conference, and recognizing too the question, what if not just the EU and the US had been involved, but Russia as well, in some sort of settlement? Was that completely out of...
That's a very good question.
I think you know what we're talking about.
Very pertinent question now in regard to Syria in particular, but also the exclusion of Iran, for example, from the negotiations there or from finding a settlement. Let me start out with on a personal note, since I'm the only Viennese here or even Austrian on this panel, because I have a personal relationship with how should I say, the spirit of Metternich, because the site of the Austrian government, of the Austrian Prime Minister, fellow Chancellor, is the Palais Metternich in Ballhausplatz in Vienna. And when I used to work there as the Chancellor's Chief of Staff, Chief of Cabinet, my office actually was the room from which were the lovers of Prince Metternich were taken to his bedroom. So it was
very romantic.
Camera, truly.
So it was quite, of course, the office was not very elaborate in the sense it was more really to work there. But the funny thing is, it was not square. It had all sort of roundish corners, so you couldn't hit. I guess it was. Anyhow, but let me start out with Yugoslavia and the demise, the violent demise of Yugoslavia, where, as we remember, the United Nations actually in finding peace did not play a role because of its rather suboptimal role during the war. For the United Nations, just to explain this, it was an extremely difficult situation from the Cold War era, where any UN intervention had to be sort of neutral, in between, to separate, to see to it that peace or the absence of war is there only after a mandate, of course. In the case of Yugoslavia, which was a combination, rather complex combination of a civil war, but also aggression, a war of aggression, the United Nations simply, with its old mandate, could not really succeed. So therefore, it was the initiative on the part of the United States, which after almost 4 years of war, decided to so to speak, under its guidance or leadership, to establish a group of the willing, so to speak, to find peace. That is clearly very different from the Vienna Congress system, and I think that's important to stress. But the interesting thing, and you mentioned Russia, is that Russia was included. And in all my dealings, both in Kosovo as well as then afterwards in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Russians were always partners, and they were very constructive partners. For example, at the negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina, Kosovo, in Rambouillet and in Paris, there were 3 negotiators, an American, European was me, and a Russian. And we were on an equal footing. And I must say that that sometimes I was closer to the Russian in finding certain solutions to some details than to the American negotiator. Again, NATO intervention which was perceived as, well, a couple of days, and then Milosevic will give in, which did not happen, went on for more than 70 days. It was actually with the help of Russia, Chernomyrdin, who convinced Milosevic that this is not going to work out for him, that he has to give in. So there was obviously a very close relationship, in spite of the fact that the NATO intervention clearly was not something that the Russians liked. Also, in the case of the Dayton Agreement, in the implementation, it was the Russians who actually accepted a de facto NATO lead for the peace implementation and for the military part of the peace implementation. And now, remember that when Crimea fell to the Russians, actually Putin was on several occasions referring to Kosovo. That this was this big disappointment for him. We have worked on your side. We tried to find a solution together, and then actually what happened, you did not really appreciate this. And I think there, after the NATO intervention, which as a lawyer put it, was illegal yet legitimate. Only a lawyer could come up with such a wonderful wording. One should have really reached out to Russia. And that did not happen, and this is for me really a reason for why actually the relationship between the West and Russia deteriorated. And it started much earlier than we would believe. Of course, 2008 was the real watershed event with the offer of NATO membership to Georgia and also, in a way, to Ukraine. You know, this is when Putin immediately reacted to it. And that 2008 event should have been a warning for the much bigger tragedy that we are now involved in. This is Ukraine, of course. Yeah? So here you can see when you do not follow certain rules, certain also, it was mentioned here already, this kind of human factor, not to take your vis-a-vis seriously, you know, is something which could have dire consequences. And in this way, indeed, the consequences were there.
Hey, Gary, do you want to pick up the original question about the legacy?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I did want to sort of pick up on that question of the ways in which Vienna offers something to practitioners. And I wanted to start by I'm a little struck by the extent to which so far the tenor of the conversation seems to be how wonderful Vienna was and how much we all have to learn from this. And this is in some ways sort of surprising, right? That you would have thought that, given that we are, I think pretty much all of us people who Metternich would have been absolutely horrified by, and that ideologically we are, almost all of us in this room, are much closer to the tradition of, let's say, Shelley than we are to the tradition of, let's say, Metternich. Shelley, who's the one who wrote, after the Peterloo massacre, who wrote, "I met murder on the way, he had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim, 7 bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they might be in admirable plight, for 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 he tossed them human hearts to chew, which from his wide cloak he drew." That these were people who were really loathed by British liberals. It wasn't just by sort of pinhead Wilsonians, but there was a sort of broad disdain for what the Vienna Order had meant, that it was something seen as, satisfying reactionary courts, satisfying the imperialists of the Holy Alliance, at the expense of some of the smaller nations of Europe. So I think while I think it's a much more complicated picture than that. Given that nobody has said that, I wanted to sort of, push back a little. But on the question of sort of where, does this matter to practitioners, I wanted to give one very practical example of somebody for whom this obviously mattered a lot. and somebody who 100% had this in his mind, which is Henry Kissinger, who in 1956 writes a piece in World Politics about reappraisal of Vienna, and is pushing back against this sort of Wilsonian view. Colonel House talked about the virtues of Versailles, is saying, for the first time in history, Europe enjoys a natural political map, or at least a fair approximation of it, a map drawn in accordance with the unforced aspirations and the spontaneous affiliations of the peoples themselves. The map of Europe drawn by the Congress of Vienna knew no such principles. People were handed from sovereignty to sovereignty like chattel, the determining factors being the ambitions, the power, and the cunning of sovereigns and their foreign ministers. And Kissinger in 1956, and then with his terrific book, A World Restored, is pushing back against that and sort of looking for the circumstances under which Vienna offers something useful to the world. And his brief is that Vienna brought a century of peace, and that there's something there that we need to rediscover. One of the things that Robert Jervis, in another classic article, wrote about also in World Politics, actually, talking about the sort of move from balance to concert, and the difference between the sort of automatic making of balance of power and the much more difficult business of a concert, is that one of the conditions, Bob Jervis says, is that the states cannot be so constrained by ideologies, personal rivalries, and national hatreds that they are unable to align and realign on the basis of what is necessary to maintain their security. And you think of instances where states are sort of put outside of the system. So the Soviet Union after 1917, where it's sort of shoved off to the side and not allowed to play a normal role in balance of power diplomacy. Iran, in the Middle East to a large extent today, Israel after 1948, that these sorts of, sort of the artificiality of saying some states are off limits. And part of what Kissinger's achievement is when in 1971 he goes to China secretly for the first time, sneaks in July of 1971, is saying that there are no states that are off limits in the system, that even Maoist China at the height of the Cultural Revolution is not something that is so ideologically radical that we can't deal with it and that we can't sort of forge something. And they're in the interests, in part, I think that I've written very critically about Kissinger and the opening to China, specifically in the way that Kissinger was then prepared to turn a blind eye to the extermination of hundreds of thousands of Bengalis because Pakistan was being helpful with the opening. But there also is a sort of moral purpose to the opening to China that Nixon and Kissinger thought correctly, that it would be easier to end the war in Vietnam if you could get the Chinese to play a more useful role, and you're more likely to do that if you open to them. So there's at least one example of a practitioner who clearly had Vienna in mind. So.
I just wanted to respond to Gary, because I have marked this down, that my personal reception and the perception rather, and the one in Austria in left liberal circles is of course a very negative one when it comes to Metternich or the Vienna Congress, because we see it from, so to speak, ex post. We see the crushed 1848 revolution, we see Vormärz, we see the spy system, the prying on everybody, Biedermeier as a reaction to it and all this stuff. This is much more, much more dominates actually the historic achievement of the Vienna Congress of Vienna. Only when you go deeper into it, when you try to see the structures, and I think there is a certain merit. Although I'm rather skeptical when it comes to a sort of telltale transfer into the 21st century, because we are now confronted with much bigger, real global issues in the age of globalization. And that really, there, I do not know whether the solution would be an all-encompassing Congress of whatever, Jakarta or some other, because it definitely could not take place in Europe.
But I mean, sounds like one of the reasons for this much more positive vision or revisionism about the Congress is that in the wake of the Cold War, while there was a lot of discussion about Marshall Plans here, Marshall Plans there, there wasn't a proposal, as far as I know, discussion for some sort of Congress or some sort of generalized meeting to take stock of the Cold War. That seems to be, now 20 years on. I mean, quite far away, but there's a sort of a large space in which a kind of seemingly both, a re-raveling, unraveling of global society in which, yes, the U.S. has huge power in certain areas, but there's an enormous debate about, in fact, where is the power, and isn't there some way the UN, not being able to do certain things, certainly doesn't launch Marshall Plans, to some moment of reconfiguration. So the question then, why wasn't there? Could there have been? What were the structural reasons that it was unimaginable or implausible? So we're asking here for some sort of counterfactual or rather fanciful, thinking. And this is a question. And we have, three huge regions here represented. What would that have looked like? What kinds of, structural imagining could you have had to have a post-Cold War settlement?
Well, yes. First of all, there were minor initiatives, perhaps. But for example, the first meeting of the Security Council at heads of state level took place a little bit after the end of the Cold War. This was an initiative by President Bush, the father. And that could have set the stage for a different kind of Security Council performance, one that would actually work more like the drafters of the UN Charter. And for a while, it looked like this might be possible, especially after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and an international coalition that involved basically the entire international community, including the Arab world, joined in considering that a major threat to peace and supported the military action that eventually drew Saddam Hussein back. So I think that the debate on Security Council expansion, it all finds its origin in that moment, and we're 20 years later, we still haven't produced an expanded Security Council. And I think there are many reasons for this, but one of the reasons today is a kind of benign neglect on the part of the major powers, and I would say the two major powers of the moment, China and the United States. They could very well sit around the table and start a process, enlist the rest of the permanent members and some others through a kind of Vienna procedure or something in that spirit, but this is not being done. So sometimes I'm reminded of this classic book that was recently published, Sleepwalking to World War I, where just by not realizing that you're living a crucial moment that requires a certain kind of leadership and new mechanisms for diplomatic cooperation, you're just letting things slide and remain as they are, and that becomes more and more dangerous. That's one argument. The other argument I'd like to make is that the picture is not so negative, actually, because in several areas that require cooperation, new mechanisms are being established. So, for example, after the financial crisis of 2008, the G7 or the G8 was expanded into the G20. And that was an immediate response to, let's say, a more multipolar world or realization, awareness that just by sitting with a like-minded or, a North Atlantic, North American table, you wouldn't really be dealing with the financial challenges in the same way as if you had let's say, the 10 largest or the 20 largest economies of the world. And no one now argues in favor of going back to the G7. It's here to stay. In other areas, there are small steps in that direction. For example, after the Rio Conference on the Environment and Development, Rio Plus 20, UNEP, which is the United Nations Environmental Program, went from being a restricted program into being a universal. The conference that meets in Nairobi is now one of universal participation. And my final thought here is that actually an incentive for closer cooperation in today's world that has not existed before. It didn't exist in Vienna. It didn't exist when the League of Nations was negotiated or when the UN Charter was negotiated, is the challenge of climate change, which really drives home very strongly the idea that there's no salvation without cooperation. Now, not surprisingly, when President Obama goes to China last year, what is the big accomplishment, the big kind of achievement that was obtained? An agreement on climate change that is paving the way, and we hope that this will be effective, for a successful Paris conference at the end of the year. If we can draw inspiration from movements such as the one seen in the G20, from the awareness that we're all in the same boat, that climate change kind of drives home, I think we can draw lessons from the past and establish the cooperative instruments that we need on the peace and security front as well.
Beatrice.
Yes. On the one hand, this is a major achievement, and that's what makes it so hard and almost impossible to do the kind of iffy history game here. What could have happened in the post-Cold War settlements? Because what is also one of the main differences now in international undertakings compared to what happened in the 19th century is the question Mr. Jervis posed in the earlier table. He said, what are they trying to regulate? What are the countries, the diplomats after? And we now live in the age which the end of history, on the one hand, is proclaimed, democracy has overcome everything. On the other hand, we live in the age of the clash of civilizations that sprung up again. So what we are trying to regulate is very much ideational, idealistically driven. The war on terror, it's all about civilizations going to war to fight for their protection, etc. Whereas the people in Vienna, they were very unambitious. They were ambitious in the stretch of their efforts, but they were unambitious in what they were trying to regulate. They were trying to regulate security. And that was indifferent whether it was an autocratic, a democratic, or a new monarchy. It didn't matter so much. That's why they all could sit at the same table. Again, in 1879, the British Prime Minister William Gladstone, Prime Minister of a liberal country, said over in memory of Vienna, he said, keeping the powers of Europe in union together was crucial to that Congress. Because by keeping all in union together, you neutralize and further bind up the selfish aims of each. I'm not here to flatter either England or any of them. All have selfish aims, as, unfortunately, we in late years have too sadly shown that we too have had selfish aims. But then common action is fatal to selfish aims. And these convictions by Gladstone, they echo what Castlereagh himself said in August 1815. It is not our business to collect trophies, but try to bring back the world to peaceful habits. So bring the world back to peaceful habits, bind selfish aims, no matter what kind of system is involved. That was the unambitious ambition of the countries of Vienna. Whereas after the Cold War, it was thought that what we had to try to regulate was not just mere security, it was victory of democracy, it was freedom to the world, the global spread of ideas, which makes it so hard to fall again behind that position of ideational standards. We cannot cooperate with Syria, we cannot cooperate with Iran, because they violate humans, women's rights at such a scale that we cannot afford ourselves to work with them anymore. But that's the major problem that makes our policies to work together sometimes too impossible.
Well, I think that your intervention will there'll be a lot of pro and con. I mean, I think the very citation of Shelley suggested that there was, and Mr. Wallach said there was indeed a powerful war against nationalisms. Question about the abolition of slavery, even these very pure notions of commerce on the Rhine, create a whole world vision of what of the should be or the ought to be, aside from the practices. But these are questions to be debated. Ambassador, did you want to chime?
Actually, first of all, I believe the Congress of Vienna was united in preventing yet another revolution after this devastating wars that have taken place, which is not the case, of course, after the Cold War, we were kind of lucky that nothing happened, you know. Cuba was close to, and it was, but it was never a hot war. And there were always proxy wars around, but not really the Big Bang War. I think this is very important. So therefore, the necessity for a sort of a peace conference was not here. But what one now, in retrospect now, and this is always 2020, what one should have done is really taken into consideration what it means for a big empire like the Soviet Union to implode. You know, and the interesting thing is also that we do not distinguish between what Gorbachev and the Soviet Union have actually dealt out or hammered out with the West, and then Russia. You know, why does Putin not feel obliged now to what happened before? It's really because this was the Soviet Union, and he represents Russia, and there is a difference. Although they claim we are in a way the successor state, but when it comes to the agreements regarding NATO and all this stuff, he is far more outspoken. You know that okay, you have not adhered to what you have promised, and this we as Russia now have to deal with it. I believe this is a very big difference. So therefore, in my opinion, what you can do is really look at the existing post-1945 system, UN, Bretton Woods, and so on, and see how can you revitalize, how can you adapt, what can be done about the UN Security Council. This is still the representatives of the victorious powers there, and I, as a European, must say, why do we have the UK and France in there? Yeah. Not because I'm neither nor, but I think it's not really a fair contribution of power and influence. So therefore, of course, and Ambassador Patriota knows this much better, for years this has been ongoing. Germany was vying for others, where I'm, in my opinion, it is not very good to focus really on individual states. Clearly, when it comes to China, it's already in there. India is another question. But when it comes to Europe, Europe should really get its act together and have one European seat there. Of course, I know it will not never happen, but it's not just around the corner. Who will give up something that the country is not forced to really, or is involved in a war, loses a war, and then the issue is out. But what I also want, this is my last point in this context, it's important to see that Europe, as the epicenter of the Cold War, indeed dealt with it. And this is, of course, the so-called CSCE process. Yeah? The Charter of Paris in 1990, the creation of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which in fact has a very, how should I say, big idea of Europe. It ranges from Vancouver to Vladivostok. And in this way, it is some sort of a common security system. And just keep in mind, who was the first organization to be in place in Ukraine? I'm not talking about efficiency and effectiveness. It was the OSCE. It is the only international regional organization active in the conflict. So this, I believe, needs to tell us something. And then, clearly, this is what is missing in other regions. I think in order to come up with some sort of a global Vienna Congress, you need regional engagement. You need regional orders, so to speak, and you need a cooperation between the regions, and then I believe you can speak about some sort of a global arrangement. And that could be the UN, of course.
Great. So just to pick up, I think, briefly on three strands. The first is that I do think that something that you get out of this discussion is how helpful it is, even if practitioners don't necessarily have this stuff in front of them, but how helpful it would be that to have that sort of longue durée, to have a greater sense that there are other models that are, that are not right in front of your face. It's actually, this is something where there's more that I could say about this, but it's actually been said better by David Armitage, who has a great new book out called The History Manifesto, which people should read, but is sort of explaining why history is important to policymakers. So that's, first thing. The second thing is I think that these are, the question about could there have been something like this after the Cold War. And I think that in some ways there are some institutional forms that we would have wanted that would look different. So I think it might have been helpful, for instance, to have a post-Cold War truth commission. That the Cold War was not a hot war for the Americans and for the Soviets, but in a lot of parts of the world it was absolutely devastating. And in many of those places in there, the fact that these issues are not talked about in, sort of that the core doesn't talk about the way that the periphery suffered, I think, contributes to certain resentments in the developing world. But there's also this sort of general problem of the Soviet Union collapses, and that means that the United States is incredibly dominant, is in this, unipolar moment. And how do you then have a functioning world system with the United States so powerful that on the one hand, the United States could be a force for getting all sorts of very, very useful things done. On the other hand, every time the United States acts, it terrifies people, right? That you, on the one hand, you have the United States intervening in Bosnia in a way that I think saved substantial numbers of human lives. On the other hand, when the United States is so effective intervening with a NATO coalition in Bosnia, it terrifies people. It makes you wonder, well, what else could the United States do? And sets in place some of the fears that you get after 2003 and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And one of the answers that you get out of Vienna is institutions, right? That there are institutional forms. And there was a quote earlier with Castlereagh being sort of fairly self-conscious about this, but Bob Jervis and Steve Krasner and Louise Richards and a bunch of political scientists have written about institutions as a form that provide a way for very, very strong states to send convincing signals that they are prepared to bind themselves, and therefore that American power after 1989 or British power after 1815 is not something that the rest of the world needs to be terrified of. It's something that the rest of the world could have a stake in. The third thing that I want to say just briefly, obviously this is, this is about Vienna and the concert of Europe. So understandably the focus is on Europe, but it is much harder to think about how this stuff could apply in Asia. It's a place where it would actually be very useful, but obviously Europe, which has been a very, an astonishingly institutionalized environment between OSCE, CSE, EU, NATO, that there's sort of, an incredible assortment. Whereas in Asia, there's just no equivalent. That Asia is deeply under-institutionalized, and when you think about building these institutions, you either get, ASEAN, which meets but doesn't really do all that much, the Shanghai initiative that's coming out of China, which seems to be more kind of pushing back against NATO or pushing back against the West. And certainly when, this discussion that we were having about Security Council reform, to have a Security Council that sort of looks more like the actual configuration of what's out there in the world as opposed to what the world looked like in 1945. This, by the way, John Bolton, who was, not my favorite person, but did suggest when there were debates about Security Council reform that one way of reforming the Security Council to accurately reflect the balance of power in the world would be to kick the other 4 countries off, and that it would just be the United States, and that would you would have a Security Council that accurately reflected the real configuration of power in the world. But more realistically, it's very hard to see. It was a good joke. Unfortunately, I think you probably meant it, but which makes it less funny. But it's very hard to imagine how you would get that. Obviously, Brazil, which is natural for the Security Council as a permanent member, but also India, Japan, and it's just unimaginable. I mean, China under no circumstances is going to let on either Japan or India, right? It's just not going to happen.
Africa.
And to have a powerful state from Africa, also hard to imagine how that could be done. So
let me start with you this time. So, today, bring it up to the global war on terrorism, and when one thinks that China has a problem of young Uyghurs who want to go to Turkey and engage, let's say, in some sort of war against China, but in the name of some fundamentalist Islam used anti its own their own state. The problem now seen very recently of young Europeans using the war in the Middle East, bringing it back home to France. Saw the same thing, the Boston massacre, young Americans becoming engaged. So, the kind of urgency of, on a global level, this involves not, China's not out of this. Could you imagine the Congress? What institutional apparatus could begin to imagine? We're going to settle the global war on terrorism. We're going to admit that it's there, like the Cold War, like previous wars. This is the form war takes. Now, drones up there, terrorists down here, huge amounts of surveillance, enormous American involvement, European involvement in this way and that way, other states involved in their varying ways, whether it's at home against their own people who are engaged and so on. So could you imagine what institutional or political positions could enable a Congress in the way that you've begun to work such a model out, functional equivalence, let's say?
It's a great and very large question. Let me sort of briefly say two things about it. One is that this question of sort of volunteers who are going off to fight in various places was actually something that came up in the Vienna system with the Philhellenes, with Brits and Germans and sort of adventurers of various stripes who would go off to fight alongside the Greeks, the most famous of them being Lord Byron, who goes off and manages to die while doing it. But the British government kind of turns a blind eye to it. They say these are private citizens, and if they want to go and sort of, the London Greek Committee was, which is sort of, it doesn't look like a proto-human rights group because Human Rights Watch does not go out and arm the rebels, whereas the London Greek Committee was buying ships for the Greeks, who were in insurrection against the Ottoman Empire, in a way that was backed by the Russians. That was utterly incompatible with what the concert was trying to do. That Russia just completely forgot its concert principles for the purposes of backing the Greek insurrection, and then later after the Battle of Navarino and after sort of the independence of Greece, then Russia sort of remembered it. So I think the concert actually doesn't have great answers for how you deal with lone wolves. That they confronted something like that and they didn't do very well. But in terms of dealing with the global war on terror, my fear actually is maybe we do have something like the concert going, and that there would be people who would say that is exactly what we have. Is that that there was a kind of moment in 2011 where people thought that the Arab Spring was going to really fundamentally change what the Middle East looks like, but that's now obviously over, right? That Tunisia made it and nobody else did. And that instead what you see are the great powers lining up quietly but distinctly behind the reactionaries. And that if you look at, the dominant form of intervention after Vienna was, as Gideon said, Gideon's joke about, the responsibility not to protect, but it was generally interventions to help one of the reactionary monarchies crush some sort of liberal insurrection somewhere. That 1848 is sort of the model of it. And that which when I was writing my book about sort of 19th century interventions, then I thought that is a museum piece, and I never expect to see that sort of thing in my lifetime. And then you have in 2011, you have Saudi Arabia doing exactly that in Bahrain. That Bahrain is not getting enough traction, crushing its own Shia, so the Saudis step up to help them. And it's exactly that form. So I think that we may, that some of the more problematic aspects of Vienna are, maybe back. Yeah.
But not willing to take on Palestine, Israel. So they're making the battles are in one area but not another.
I don't see how an international concert would solve that, right? And I think John Kerry is very energetic, but you have, you know, you have Hamas in a position where I think it may take them decades for Hamas, in the same way that the PLO went from its sort of radical phase to a phase where it was more willing to consider accommodation with Israel. How long it will take Hamas to go through that phase and how much damage Netanyahu can do along the way, it just doesn't strike me as particularly ripe for resolution. And even with different institutional forms, I'm not sure, short of, you know, massive deployment of troops, which just doesn't seem to be on the cards. It's hard for me at least, I mean, maybe I'm lacking imagination here, but to see how that's ripe for resolution.
Interesting. Yeah. Ambassador.
Well, actually, the war on terror was mentioned. And my impression is that actually the theater of this war is more Europe than any other part of the world. And that is something which is very much and very intimately tied into the setup of the European Union, a project which is hit in midway by those global trends. That applies both to the economy, so the Lehman moment is still around 7-8 years after and going on and hampering the development, you know. But the same applies to the so-called war on terror. A misnomer, in my opinion, very bad that this was actually introduced because this gives those terrorists sort of a raison d'être. We are fighting a war, which is, of course, a thing, but it's very unfortunate. And the second is, it's not, so to speak, just an attack from the outside. Europe is being attacked from the inside, so to speak. You know, because of the economic crisis, we have now not so much the question any longer who is going to join the European Union expansion, which is, of course, still on the agenda. It's more who is going to leave the European Union. Is it going to be a Brexit? Is it going to be a Grexit? What is Catalonia going to do? Scotland, and so on. I mean, this is actually something which is far more dangerous for not just the European Union, but for the global system of security in general. That is, again, something which can only be repaired, so to speak, or tackled by the Europeans themselves. And clearly it's going to be the big question, in my opinion, when it comes to such a global aspiration, let me put it this way, to how can we actually negotiate international order which would open the change within states. That's the authoritarian countries that we are, of course, thinking at. Democracy promotion, also another misnomer. And at the same time avoid using these changes as instruments of geopolitical competition, which is happening in Ukraine, for example. Yeah, I think that what we need really is a very fresh approach when it comes to tackle those systemic issues of global security.
Thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, yes.
Yes, but of course the Congress of Vienna was a perfect example of how a war on terror could look like. And it was exactly what Petritsch was trying to do. And you could argue that the 1818, 1819 Karlsbader Beschlüsse were his Patriot Acts, of course. And he tried to transform the whole ambassadorial conferences, which Brian Vick told us about. He tried to turn them explicitly through his envoys in a sort of transnational European security police. And exactly these efforts by Metternich to turn the whole apparatus of the Congress on radical uprisings and unrest in Europe, that was what tainted the memory of the Vienna Congress until the current day. So, and you mentioned the Phil Helens. Of course, they didn't come back to bomb something, but opposed to perhaps Syrian fighters in Europe nowadays. But the point is that what Metternich tried to do in what we had in 2001-2002 was exactly that, what undermined the collective cooperations of the European nations. There were two conflicting security logics. The logics, if you could argue, of Wellington and Castlereagh, and also the Dutch and some other countries, who said that the security logic means that you have to protect together, jointly, domestic order, but only in the sense that physical violence doesn't erupt anymore and that external hegemonic aspirations are prevented. For Metternich, he translated the fear of war, the fear of Napoleon, into security practices, and it's a sort of a Latour chain of translations, fear of war, fear of Napoleon, security regimes, fear of domestic uprising, revolution, fear of domestic unrest, in a sort of oligarchy of the thrones. So if we try to do the impossible and compare that to current day practices in terrorism, I would strongly argue against any attempt of that kind to sort of set up a new global unified security police. I mean, they're trying to do that in Europe through Europol, and that's working quite okay and well because it's based within the legal boundaries and constraints and the laws that were drafted by the EU. But there's this at present there is this struggle going on that the United States tries to sort of blackmail almost the European Parliament by the help of the European Commission in accepting very strong-reaching, far-reaching security measures in order to get their trade arrangements with the rehearsal of the new trade agreement. The European Parliament is dead against it because that would mean that the United States may lay hold on all the passenger, the travel data, the telephonic data by the EU. And there's a number of states in the EU that argue that if there is something collectively unified attempts to tackle terrorism, it should be based within international and the national laws and not just merely security driven. So I think in this case, the Congress of Vienna teaches us a lesson not to be too ambitious in joining forces in beating terrorism, because you could end up with a lot of function creep and collateral damage, as Snowden and Manning, of course, have revealed. So there's a lesson in that.
Very, very interesting. Ambassador.
So many angles from which you could try to look at this. I actually happen to think that combating terrorism is a very unifying factor nowadays among the main powers, because as you have given examples of, every permanent member of the Security Council has to deal with terrorist threats, whether it's the Uyghurs in China or the Chechens in Russia, United States, Britain and France now have gone through episodes. So it potentially can be a good topic for a more cooperative international effort to take place. Now, one of the reasons that is not happening completely, it is happening to a certain extent, is that some of the strategies attempted during the 21st century to wage a war on terror have been extremely counterproductive. In fact, none of us would like to live under a regime such as Saddam Hussein's or Colonel Gaddafi, but the truth is that the intervention in Iraq introduced terrorism into a country where it did not previously exist, and now it's kind of mushroomed into a tremendously threatening form of terrorism, which is the one that ISIS and the others in that region have been waging. Similarly, in Libya, a resolution which had been passed by the Security Council to allow for protection of civilians was interpreted unilaterally by NATO as allowing for regime change. Now, regime change sounds like a very, let's say, morally sound proposition if you replace a dictator with a more democratic government. The problem is that what the 21st century demonstrates is that a bad situation can be made much worse through military strategies alone, or strategies that don't actually think out what the day after is supposed to bring. So now what we see in Northern Africa is not only terrorism in Libya, but spreading to Algeria, to Mali, to the entire Sahel. Weapons are even finding their way into the Central African Republic. So I think for there to be a better concerted and cooperative effort against this new form of instability that we are all against, we also have to take a very kind of critical approach to what has not worked during the past 15 years or so. And it involves also a very difficult transition, I think, for the United States, because the United States, while recognizing that the world is becoming multipolar, it still kind of takes a view that, you know, it can sidestep certain international rules, whether it's about drones, you were mentioning several of them, or intervening unilaterally in countries without Security Council approval. Well, if everyone starts doing that in a multipolar world, it's a recipe for chaos. So I think we really need to think this out, and the responsibility of this country is enormous, but there are many signs that the major powers are ready to cooperate.
Okay, well, sum up, it sounds like, you know, the Congress is very good for thinking. It may not be good for making foreign policy. On that, I really want to thank you. It's very helpful, very rich. I want to invite you now to have a drink with us, a reception, and we'll be continuing tomorrow morning at 9, really 9:30, but 9 is breakfast, and we'll be in another building. We'll be on the 15th floor of the School of International Relations, a beautiful sunny room next door. Thank you so much.